At 2:07 the morning, when most of the city of El Paso was asleep, a single taco truck sat alone near a forgotten highway ramp, its lights dim, its metal sides cold to the touch. Inside that truck stood a man who had worked all night and earned almost nothing. He did not know it yet, but heaven was about to test him, not with wealth, not with power, but with hunger. Because sometimes Jesus does not come in light or glory. Sometimes he comes disguised as a stranger with empty pockets and tired eyes. That night, Ray Gutierrez had only 3 tacos left. 3 chances to make it home. 3 chances to feed his family. 3 chances to survive one more day. And when a dusty man stepped out of the darkness and quietly asked, "How much for a taco, son?" Ray faced a choice that would change everything. A choice that raises a question for all of us. If Jesus stood before you tonight, hungry, broken, and unnoticed, would you recognize him? And if you did, would you give him your last meal? This is the true story of a poor taco man who gave without expecting a miracle and discovered that heaven never forgets a generous heart. The cold came early that night in El Paso, a dry, desert cold that crept through clothes and settled deep in the bones. Ray Gutierrez pulled his jacket tighter as he stood inside his old taco truck, parked just off the highway where semis sometimes stopped for fuel and sometimes for food. The flickering glow of a single streetlight washed the pavement in a dull yellow, making everything feel tired, forgotten. Ray had been here for 17 years. Same corner, same truck, same long nights. But never had it felt this heavy. He glanced at the small plastic tray on the counter and swallowed hard. 3 tacos. That was all he had sold in 11 hours. 3. He opened the rusted cash box and counted again, just to be sure. $7. Wrinkled bills. Loose coins. The kind of money that felt heavier because of what it couldn't do. $7 wouldn't even cover gas to get home. Ray leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment. His hands shook not just from the cold, but from fear. Real fear. The kind that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. He was 62 years old, but that night he felt closer to 80. His hands were scarred from years of hot grills and sharp knives, the skin thick and burned in places. Those hands had fed thousands of people, truck drivers, construction workers, night shift nurses, but tonight they had barely fed anyone. Ray reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small, folded photograph. The edges were worn soft from being handled too often. Martha, his wife. In the picture, she was smiling thin, but smiling sitting on the steps of their apartment with their 2 children. Carlos was only 9 now, Rosie 7. In the photo, they were younger, happier. Before, sickness moved in and took up residence. "I'm sorry," Ray whispered to the photo. "I promised you I'd take care of you." Martha's diabetes had gotten worse this year. The doctor warned them not to skip her medication again. Insulin wasn't optional, and neither was food. Ray's eyes drifted toward the propane tank under the truck. The gauge hovered just above empty. 2 more nights, maybe less. After that, no fire, no tacos, no income. And then there was the rent. Earlier that afternoon, Mr. Briggs, the owner of the lot, had stopped by in his clean pickup truck, sunglasses on, voice polite but cold. "Ray, I like you," he'd said. "But business is business. You're 3 months behind. If you don't catch up soon, I've got others willing to pay more for this spot." Ray owed almost $900, a mountain he couldn't climb. Now, alone in the night, he looked up at the sky. The city lights usually swallowed the stars, but tonight, one faint point of light peeked through the haze. "Lord," Ray said softly, his voice cracking, "I know I'm not perfect. I lose my temper. I get tired. I doubt. But please, don't let me fall." He swallowed hard. "My wife needs me. My kids need me. If you're still listening, give me a sign. Anything. Just don't leave us." The night answered with silence. A truck roared past in the distance. A stray dog barked somewhere behind a gas station. The streetlight buzzed overhead. That was all. Ray exhaled slowly and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He picked up a greasy rag and began cleaning the grill, even though it was already clean. He needed something to do, something to keep his hands from shaking. It was time to close. He reached for the small switch that powered the menu light, the one with prices written in chalk when he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, uneven, dragging slightly across cracked pavement. Ray froze and looked up. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A man walked toward the truck, hunched slightly, clothes coated in dust like he'd traveled a long road on foot. His white shirt had once been clean, but now it carried the color of the earth. His jeans were torn at the knees. His shoes were worn thin, but it was his face that stopped Ray's breath. A beard untrimmed, lines of exhaustion etched deep, and eyes tired beyond words, yet calm, peaceful in a way Ray couldn't explain. The man stopped at the counter and glanced at the grill, at the last pieces of meat still warm from the dying flame. "Good evening, son," the stranger said gently. Ray nodded, unsure why his chest suddenly felt tight. "Good evening, sir," he replied. "What can I get you?" The man hesitated, then asked quietly, "How much for a taco?" Ray looked down at the 3 remaining portions. 3 tacos, $7. Everything he had left. And in that moment, before the miracle, before the light, before heaven opened, Ray Gutierrez stood at the edge of a decision that would reveal the true measure of his faith. Ray did not answer right away. He stood there, staring at the last 3 portions of meat resting on the grill, their edges still glistening from the fading flame. The sizzle had softened to a whisper, like the grill itself was growing tired just like him. "How much for a taco?" the man asked again, gently this time. Ray lifted his eyes. The stranger stood quietly, hands resting at his sides, not leaning forward, not rushing him. There was no impatience in his posture, no entitlement, just waiting. $2, Ray finally said. The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than the price. Then his gaze drifted not to the cash box, not to the menu, but to Ray's face. His eyes lingered there, longer than normal. Not staring, seeing. Ray felt it immediately. This man had no money. It was a recognition that came without logic, without proof. A knowing born from years of standing behind a counter, watching people hesitate, watching hands reach into empty pockets. Hunger had a look, so did dignity, and the man in front of him carried both. Ray's chest tightened. If he sold those 3 tacos, he might make it home. He could stop at the discount store, maybe buy a small loaf of bread. Maybe Martha wouldn't have to skip dinner again. But if he didn't, he would go home empty-handed. Again. The stranger shifted his weight slightly, the worn soles of his shoes scraping the concrete. Up close, Ray noticed the man's hands dirty, cracked, marked by labor, hands that had known work, hands that had known loss. Ray swallowed. He thought of his wife lying awake, pretending to sleep so the children wouldn't worry. He thought of Carlos asking why Mom looked so tired lately. He thought of Rosie's shoes with the loose sole he kept meaning to fix. And then, beneath all those thoughts, something else stirred. A quiet pull. A pressure not from fear, but from compassion. It was as if a voice rose from somewhere deep inside him, not loud, not commanding, but steady. Feed him. Ray exhaled slowly. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in surrender. He looked back at the man and forced a small smile, one that carried more sadness than joy. "Don't worry about it," Ray said. "Tonight's on me." The man blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't want to take from you if you can't spare it." Ray shook his head. "I can spare it," he said quietly. "Please, sit down." The man hesitated only a second longer before nodding. He moved to the small plastic stool beside the truck, the one with a crack down the leg, and sat carefully, as if he didn't want to break something that already looked fragile. Ray turned back to the grill and reached for the propane knob. He twisted it, just enough. The flame flickered back to life, weak but steady, fed by whatever little gas remained. He worked slowly, intentionally. He sliced the meat with care, as though preparing something sacred. He warmed the tortillas until they were just right soft, but with a hint of crisp at the edges. He chopped onions and cilantro, squeezing fresh lime over the meat. Then he reached for the salsa, the special one, the one Martha had taught him to make when they were young and hopeful, when the future felt wide open and forgiving. He hadn't planned to use it tonight. It was supposed to last another day, but he used it anyway. When the tacos were ready, Ray placed them gently on a chipped plate and filled a paper cup with cold water from the cooler, the same water he drank himself. He carried everything to the counter and set it before the man. "There you go," Ray said softly. "Enjoy." The stranger looked down at the food, and for a moment he didn't touch it. His expression shifted, something like gratitude, something like sorrow. His eyes glistened, just barely. "God bless you," the man murmured. Then he began to eat. Ray stepped back, pretending to wipe down the counter. He didn't want the man to feel watched, but his hands trembled as he moved the rag in slow circles. He had just given away the last thing he owned for the night. No money, no food, no backup plan, and yet strangely he felt no regret, only a quiet, unsettling peace. As the stranger ate in silence, savoring every bite, Ray wondered why his heart was beating so fast, and why, for the first time in months, the fear that had followed him everywhere had gone quiet. The man ate slowly, not the way someone eats when they're in a hurry, not the way people eat when food is cheap and easily replaced. He ate as if every bite mattered, as if each mouthful carried weight. Ray watched from a distance, pretending to clean the grill again. The metal was already spotless, but his hands needed something to hold on to, something solid. As the stranger lifted the first taco, Ray noticed the way his fingers trembled just slightly. Hunger does that to a person. It steals strength quietly, without announcement. Ray had felt it himself more times than he cared to remember. The man closed his eyes as he took the first bite. Ray felt something twist inside his chest. It was such a small thing. 3 tacos. Corn tortillas, meat, onions, salsa. Food people passed by every day without a second thought. And yet, in this moment, it felt enormous. Because those tacos were not extra. They were not leftovers. They were everything Ray had left. He thought again of Martha, of the way she tried to smile through exhaustion, of the insulin bottles lined up on the kitchen counter, each one a reminder of money they didn't have. He thought of Carlos and Rosie sleeping under thin blankets, dreaming of things children should dream about: school, friends, tomorrow. And still, he had given. Not because someone forced him, not because he expected a miracle, but because something in his heart would not allow him to do otherwise. The stranger ate the second taco, slower than the first. Ray turned away, suddenly overwhelmed. He leaned against the inside wall of the truck and pressed his palm flat against the cool metal, steadying himself. "What am I doing?" he whispered. He had crossed a line, a quiet one, a line between self-preservation and surrender. There would be consequences. Tomorrow he would wake up with no money, no gas, no meat to buy, no answers for his family. And yet, the peace remained. It didn't make sense. The man finished the last taco and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He drank the water to the final drop, then placed the empty cup carefully on the counter, as if it mattered where it rested. He stood. Ray turned back just as the man straightened his posture. For the first time, the stranger seemed taller, stronger. His tired shoulders lifted, and when he looked at Ray again, something had changed. The exhaustion in his eyes was still there, but beneath it was something else. Light. Not the kind that shines outward. The kind that looks inward. The kind that sees. "Was everything okay?" Ray asked, his voice unsteady. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he held Ray's gaze. And in that instant, Ray felt exposed, like every fear, every doubt, every sleepless night had been laid bare, as if nothing in his life was hidden anymore. Then the man spoke. "Tonight," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "you fed the one who was hungry." Ray blinked. "And heaven," the man continued, Does not forget. A shiver ran down Ray's spine. He opened his mouth to respond, to ask what the man meant, to say something, anything, but before a single word could form, the stranger stepped back. Ray blinked again, and the man was gone. Not walking away, not fading into the distance, gone. Ray stepped forward, heart pounding. He looked left, right, down the empty stretch of road. There was nowhere to hide, no alley, no doorway. "Sir?" Ray called out, his voice cracking. Only silence answered. Then, light. Not harsh, not blinding. A warm, white glow flooded the inside of the truck, spilling out onto the pavement like something alive. Ray raised his arm to shield his eyes, but the light didn't hurt. It wrapped around him, gentle and overwhelming all at once. And with it came a scent. Flowers. Fresh, clean, impossible. Roses, lilies. Springtime right there in a place that usually smelled like fuel and dust. Ray's knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, breath caught in his chest, heart racing with a realization that struck him all at once, clear and undeniable. The stranger hadn't been just a man, and the tacos he had given away were not just food. Ray stayed on his knees, frozen in place. The light surrounded him, not sharp, not blinding, but alive. It felt warm, like standing in the early morning sun after a long winter night. He slowly lowered his arm, realizing the brightness did not hurt his eyes at all. Instead, it filled him with a peace so deep it made his chest ache. The air around the truck shimmered, and the scent, the scent, it didn't belong here. Not in a cracked parking lot beside a highway ramp, not among oil stains and discarded soda cups. It smelled like flowers just cut from a garden, like spring breaking through stone, roses, lilies, clean and holy. Ray's breath came in short gasps. This can't be real," he whispered. His eyes darted to the place where the stranger had been sitting moments earlier. The plastic stool stood empty. The plate was clean, the cup was dry. Then he saw it. On the pavement, right where the man's feet had rested, lay a bill. Ray's hands trembled as he crawled forward and picked it up. The paper felt thick, crisp, new. He held it up under the streetlight, turning it slowly. $100. Not wrinkled, not old, not torn. Perfect. Ray stared at it as if it might disappear. He pinched the edge between his fingers. Real. Completely real. His heart began to pound so hard he could hear it in his ears. Then a sound behind him made him turn. A low, mechanical hum. Ray looked back toward the grill, and his breath caught in his throat. The meat tray was full. Not half full. Not enough for a few tacos. Full. Fresh cuts of meat lay piled neatly, where moments ago there had been nothing. The surface glistened, warm and seasoned, releasing a familiar aroma, rich, savory, alive. Enough meat to serve dozens, maybe more. Ray stumbled backward, gripping the counter to keep from falling. "No, no, no," he murmured. "That's not possible." He reached out with one shaking finger and touched the meat. Warm, tender, real. His knees gave out again. Ray collapsed onto the pavement, clutching the $100 bill to his chest as tears poured freely down his face. Years of fear, of quiet desperation, of unanswered prayers broke loose all at once. "It was you," he sobbed. "It was you." The truth settled over him, not slowly, not gently, but with absolute certainty. Jesus had stood at his truck. Jesus had looked him in the eyes. Jesus had eaten the food he almost kept for himself. Ray wept openly, unashamed. He cried for the nights he had gone home empty-handed, for the times he had doubted, for every prayer he thought had fallen into silence. And now heaven had answered. The light slowly began to fade, retreating like a tide pulling back into the unseen. The scent lingered a moment longer, then softened, until the air once again smelled like asphalt and dust. Ray wiped his eyes and looked around. The street was quiet, but everything had changed. He pushed himself to his feet, still trembling, and stared at the grill again. The meat remained, solid, undeniable. He looked down at the bill in his hand. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, lifting his gaze toward the dark sky. "Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for coming to my truck." He stayed there for a long time, unsure how long had passed, until the first hint of dawn began to lighten the horizon. Pale pink and orange streaked the sky, washing the night away. Ray straightened his jacket and took a deep breath. He knew his life would never be the same. Not because he had received money, not because food had appeared from nothing, but because he had touched the divine. Because heaven had come to him not in a church, not in a vision, but in the form of a hungry stranger asking for a taco. As the sun rose higher, Ray cleaned the grill one last time, his movements calm and deliberate. He locked up the truck, slipped the $100 bill into his pocket like something sacred, and began the walk home. For the first time in months, his steps felt light. Behind him, the taco truck stood quietly in the growing morning light, still carrying the warmth of a miracle. And ahead of him waited a family, a future, and a faith that had just been set on fire. Ray reached their apartment just as the sun cleared the rooftops. Normally, he came home before dawn, quiet, defeated, careful not to wake anyone. But this morning was different. His steps were lighter, his chest still tight from everything he had seen. The $100 bill rested in the inside pocket of his jacket, pressed close to his heart like something fragile and holy. He unlocked the door softly. The apartment was small. 2 rooms, peeling paint, a couch that doubled as a bed, the kind of place where every sound carried. Ray held his breath as he stepped inside. Martha was awake. She sat upright on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, her face pale but alert. Dark circles framed her eyes, marks of nights spent waiting. "Ray," she whispered, "is that you?" He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands into his. "I'm here," he said. "I'm okay." Her eyes searched his face. "Something's different," she murmured. "What happened?" Ray swallowed. His words came out tangled at first, tripping over one another. "I don't know how to say this without sounding crazy," he said, "but I swear on our children, on everything holy, I'm telling you the truth." He reached into his pocket and placed the bill gently into her hands. Martha stared at it, confused. Then her eyes widened. "Ray, where did you get this?" His voice broke. "From Jesus." Silence filled the room. "Jesus came to my truck last night," he continued, tears rising again. "He was hungry. I gave him the last 3 tacos I had. I didn't know it was him, not until he disappeared." Martha's lips trembled. Ray, he told her everything. The dusty stranger, the decision to give when he had nothing left, the words the man spoke, the light, the scent of flowers, the money, the meat that appeared from nowhere. Martha listened without interrupting. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed the bill to her chest. "I told you," she whispered through sobs. "I told you he wouldn't forget us." She pulled Ray into an embrace, weak but fierce, holding him like someone who had been pulled back from the edge. Carlos and Rosie stirred on the couch. Rosie rubbed her eyes, confused. Carlos sat up slowly, sensing the emotion in the room. "Mom?" he asked. "Why are you crying?" Martha smiled through tears. "Because God took care of us," she said. "Because your father did something very brave." Later that morning, Ray used part of the money to buy Martha's medication. The pharmacist looked surprised when Ray paid without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, Martha took her insulin without fear of what tomorrow would cost. Color returned just a little to her cheeks. Before sunset, Ray returned to the truck. He needed to see it again. Needed to know the night hadn't been a dream born of exhaustion and hunger. The truck stood where he had left it. He unlocked the door with shaking hands and lifted the metal lid over the grill. The meat was still there, fresh, fragrant, perfect, not spoiled by the heat, not dried out, as if time itself had paused. Ray crossed himself and whispered, "Lord, I don't know what you want from me, but I'm here." That evening he opened as usual, but something had changed. People stopped, more than usual, Drivers who normally passed by pulled over. A man took one bite and paused. "These are the best tacos I've ever had," he said quietly. Ray only smiled. "I had some help." By the end of the night, the truck was surrounded by people, and the meat never ran out. No matter how much he served, there was always more. Ray worked until his arms ached, but the exhaustion felt different now. Lighter, purposeful. As he closed for the night, Ray realized something with calm certainty. The miracle had not ended at the truck. It had followed him home. It had entered his family. And it was about to test him again. The miracle did not make life easier. It made it louder. Within days, word spread about Ray's truck. Drivers told other drivers. Night shift workers came back with friends. People who had never stopped before slowed down, curious, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Ray worked harder than ever, but he didn't feel afraid. Until Mr. Briggs returned. The pickup truck pulled in just before sunset, clean and confident, tires crunching against gravel. Mr. Briggs stepped out wearing a pressed jacket and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ray," he said, glancing at the growing line, "looks like business is good." Ray wiped his hands on his apron. "It's been busy." Mr. Briggs nodded slowly, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about." Ray's stomach tightened. "The contract," Mr. Briggs continued. "It expires at the end of next month. I've had some interest in this spot. Corporate people. They're offering triple what you pay." Ray felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "But I've been here 17 years, he said quietly. "My permits are clean. I'm catching up on rent." Mr. Briggs shrugged. "Nothing personal, just business." Two men stepped out of the truck behind him, sharp suits, polished shoes, eyes that measured everything. One of them spoke. "We're looking to expand. This location is ideal." Ray stared at them, heart pounding. "This is my livelihood," he said. "My family depends on this truck." The man adjusted his tie. "Legally, the owner has the right not to renew." They left without another word. The line of customers stood in awkward silence. Ray forced a smile and kept working, but his hands shook. That night, after closing, Ray sat alone in the truck, staring at the grill still full of meat. The miracle was still there, undeniable, and yet everything felt threatened again. "Why?" he whispered into the darkness. "You saved us. You came to me. Why let them take it now?" No thunder answered, no voice. Only a faint breeze that carried just for a moment the same delicate scent of flowers. Ray closed his eyes. "Trust me." The words did not come from outside. They rose from somewhere deeper than fear. The next morning, Ray went to see Father Thomas. The church was small and old, its wooden pews worn smooth by decades of prayer. Father Thomas stood in the garden, tending to a row of struggling roses. "Father," Ray said, "I don't understand." The priest listened as Ray explained everything, the threat, the fear, the possibility of losing it all again. When Ray finished, Father Thomas remained silent for a long moment. "Do you know the story of Job?" he asked gently. "A little," Ray said. "He lost everything." "Yes?" The priest nodded. "He was righteous and still suffered." Ray's voice trembled. "But Father, I just received a miracle. Jesus came to me. Why would God allow this now?" Father Thomas placed a hand on Ray's shoulder. "Miracles do not exempt us from trials, my son. Sometimes they invite them." Ray frowned. "Then what's the point?" "To see whether we trust God only when blessings flow," the priest said softly, "or also when they are threatened." Ray looked down at the dirt beneath his feet. "I have responsibilities. I can't just wait and hope." "And you shouldn't," Father Thomas replied. "Do what you must. Fight for what's right. But do not let fear replace faith." Ray nodded, though his chest still felt heavy. The days that followed were restless. Ray searched for other spots. Every option failed. Too expensive, too far. Already taken, doors closed one by one. At night, he lay awake listening to Martha breathe, watching the ceiling fan spin slowly. The miracle had healed her body, but the uncertainty gnawed at his spirit. "What if I lose everything again?" he whispered into the dark. Still, he opened the truck every evening. Still, he served with care. Still, he gave. One night, a woman approached the counter holding a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Her clothes were clean but worn. Her eyes carried the same look Ray had seen before: hunger, pride, fear. "How much for a taco?" she asked quietly. Ray hesitated only a second. "Tonight," he said gently. "Mothers eat free." Carlos watched from the back of the truck. Later, as they closed, his son asked, "Dad, why did you give food away? We might lose this place." Ray knelt to meet his eyes. "Because, son, the miracle didn't teach me how to get rich. It taught me how to trust." Carlos nodded slowly, not fully understanding but believing. That night, Ray prayed differently, not for protection, not for answers, but for courage. And somewhere beyond fear and uncertainty, heaven listened quietly, preparing what Ray could not yet see. The woman stood at the edge of the light, half in shadow. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hair was pulled back hastily, dark strands slipping loose around her face. In her arms, a baby slept, wrapped in a thin blanket that had seen better days. The child's breathing was shallow but steady, a small chest rising and falling against her shoulder. Ray recognized the look immediately. It was the same look he had seen that night. Hunger, quiet, dignified, desperate. "How much for a taco?" the woman asked, barely above a whisper. Ray glanced at the register. He knew the numbers by heart now. Business had been better, but the threat still loomed. The contract, the suits, the uncertainty hanging over his family like a shadow. $3, he answered gently. The woman nodded, then looked down, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I thought it might be less," she said. "I'm sorry. Thank you anyway." She turned to leave. "Wait," Ray said. She froze, afraid to hope. Ray leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter. "Tonight we have a special," he said softly. "First tacos for moms are free." The woman stared at him, eyes filling with tears. "Are you serious?" Ray smiled. "How many would you like?" She hesitated. "3. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Everything I have goes to my baby." Ray nodded and turned back to the grill. He didn't make 3 tacos. He made 5. He worked carefully, deliberately, just as he had before, warming the tortillas, seasoning the meat, adding extra onions and cilantro. He wrapped the tacos in foil to keep them warm and filled a bottle with cold water. When he placed the bundle in her hands, the woman broke down. "Thank you," she sobbed. "You have no idea what this means." Ray shook his head. "God does," he said quietly, "and He sees you." She left, clutching the food to her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. Carlos had watched everything. As Ray wiped down the counter, his son spoke. "Dad, we're still in trouble. What if we lose this place?" Ray crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Carlos," he said, "a few weeks ago I was just like her. I had nothing. I was scared. And Jesus came to my truck." Carlos's eyes widened. "You think that could have been him again?" Ray nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe he was watching." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "What he taught me wasn't how to avoid problems. It was how to love, even when we're afraid." Carlos thought about that for a long moment, then nodded. That night, as Ray locked up the truck, he felt something shift inside him. The miracle was no longer something that had happened to him. It was something he was now living. And in choosing generosity again without promise, without protection, Ray unknowingly stepped into the next chapter of heaven's plan. Because the second test had been passed, and the world was about to hear his story. The phone rang the next afternoon while Ray was cleaning the grill. He almost didn't answer. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. Ray hesitated, then wiped his hands on his apron and picked up. "Hello? Mr. Gutierrez?" a woman's voice asked, professional but warm. "My name is Gabriela Mendoza. I'm a producer with a local news station here in Texas." Ray straightened instinctively. Yes, this is Ray. We received information about your food truck, she continued, and about a rather unusual story connected to it. We were wondering if you'd be willing to talk with us. Ray's heart skipped. What kind of story? He asked, though he already knew. We were told you believe you had an encounter with Jesus, Gabriella said gently, and that since then, something extraordinary has been happening at your truck. Ray closed his eyes. For a moment, fear rose like a wave. Fear of being laughed at, of being called foolish, of putting a target on his family's back. I'm just a taco man, he said quietly. I don't want trouble. I understand, Gabriella replied, and you have every right to say no. But I'll be honest with you, people are hurting right now. Many feel forgotten. Stories like yours, they give hope. Ray promised to think about it. That evening he told Martha. She listened in silence, then took his hand. Tell it, she said softly. Not for attention, not for money. Tell it for the people who are praying like we were wondering if God still sees them. Ray nodded slowly. The next day, the news crew arrived. The camera captured everything, the worn edges of the truck, the handwritten menu, the grill that had fed a miracle. Gabriella sat across from Ray, a microphone between them, her eyes attentive and kind. When you're ready, she said, tell me what happened that night. Ray took a deep breath. He told the story exactly as it happened. The hunger, the stranger, the 3 tacos, the light, the scent of flowers, the money, the meat that never ran out. No exaggeration, no embellishment, just truth. Do you really believe that man was Jesus? Gabriella asked softly. Ray didn't hesitate. With everything I am. And why do you think he came to you? She asked. Ray paused, then shook his head. I don't know. I'm nobody special. I think he wanted to remind us that he's still here, in the hungry, in the tired, in the ones we usually walk past. The interview aired 2 nights later. Ray watched from a neighbor's living room, surrounded by people from the block. The room fell silent as his face appeared on screen. Some cried, some clasped their hands together. Even the toughest men wiped their eyes when Ray spoke the words, "When we feed the hungry, we feed him." By morning, the story had spread. Calls came in, messages, strangers lining up not just for tacos but to say thank you, to share their own pain, their own doubts, their own prayers. Ray felt overwhelmed, but beneath it all, there was peace. Because he knew now without question that the miracle had never been meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be shared. And somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the noise, heaven was quietly arranging the next move. The morning after the broadcast, Ray's phone would not stop ringing. Numbers he didn't recognize, messages he didn't expect. Some were reporters, some were strangers thanking him for his story. Others were simply people asking for prayer. Ray answered a few, then turned the phone off. He needed quiet. By noon, another call came through, this one marked private number. Something in Ray's chest tightened as he answered. Mr. Gutierrez, a man said calmly. My name is Robert Salazar. I work with the county's Office of Community Development. I saw your story last night. Ray hesitated. Okay. I'd like to meet with you, Salazar continued. There are some things about your situation that concern us, especially regarding the property where your truck operates. They agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe near the church. Salazar was in his early 50s, dressed professionally but without arrogance. He shook Ray's hand firmly and gestured for him to sit. I'll be direct, Salazar said. What's happening to you isn't right. Ray frowned. Mr. Briggs owns the lot. He doesn't want to renew my contract. Yes, Salazar nodded. And legally, that's true. But when we looked into the property, we found some irregularities, zoning issues, documentation that was never properly finalized. Ray blinked. I don't understand. What I'm saying, Salazar explained, is that the owner has been operating in a gray area for years, and now that your case is public, that gray area matters. Ray sat back, stunned. There's more, Salazar continued. Our office runs a program to support small businesses that serve their communities. Your truck does exactly that. We're prepared to step in." Ray's voice trembled. "Step in how?" "We can acquire the lot," Salazar said simply. "Regularize it, and offer you a long-term lease, 30 years, at a rate you can afford." Ray felt the world tilt. 30 years, he whispered. Salazar nodded. "And that's not all. We can also help fund upgrades, a permanent structure, safe utilities, a place that reflects what your truck has become." Tears welled in Ray's eyes. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I never wanted trouble." Salazar smiled gently. "You didn't ask for attention either. But sometimes light reveals things that have been hidden for a long time." Later that day, Mr. Briggs called. His tone had changed. "Ray," he said carefully, "about the contract, maybe we can work something out." Ray closed his eyes. "I think someone else will be handling that now," he replied softly. When Ray left the cafe, Father Thomas was waiting outside. "I thought you might want company," the priest said. Ray nodded, unable to speak. They stood together in silence for a moment. "You see," Father Thomas said at last, "God doesn't always move mountains. Sometimes he moves paperwork." Ray laughed through tears. That night, Ray returned to the truck. He stood beneath the soft glow of the lights, listening to the sounds of the city. Cars passed. People laughed. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded away. For the first time since the miracle, the fear was gone. Not because life was easy, but because justice had found a way through. Ray looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." And though there was no light this time, no scent of flowers, Ray felt it clearly. He was not alone. The ground beneath his feet had been made firm, and what had begun as 3 tacos in the dark had now become something far greater than survival. It had become a foundation. The new structure opened 3 months later. What had once been a dented food truck parked beneath a flickering streetlight was now a small, permanent stand with solid walls, a proper roof, and warm lights that welcomed anyone passing by. The sign above the counter read, "Tacos of Grace." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Sometimes heaven comes disguised as hunger." Ray stood behind the counter wearing a clean apron, his hands still rough, still scarred, but steadier now. Martha stood beside him, her cheeks fuller, her eyes brighter. Carlos and Rosie darted back and forth, laughing, handing napkins to customers with the kind of joy that only children who feel safe can carry. The place was full. Truck drivers, night nurses, construction workers, elderly neighbors, mothers with children, people who came for tacos, and people who came because they had nowhere else to go. Ray never rushed them. He listened. He learned names, stories, struggles, and every night, without exception, Ray saved the last 3 tacos. They were never advertised, never announced. But somehow, the right people always showed up at the right time. A man who hadn't eaten in 2 days. A woman escaping an abusive home. A teenager sleeping in his car. Ray would look into their eyes, recognize the familiar hunger, and quietly say, "Tonight's on me." Carlos noticed. "Dad," he asked one evening as they closed, "why always 3?" Ray smiled gently. "Because that's how many I gave away the night Jesus came." Carlos nodded, understanding more than Ray realized. Word spread not just about the miracle, but about the heart behind it. People began leaving notes taped to the counter. "Your story kept me alive. I came here ready to give up. Thank you for seeing me." One afternoon, an elderly woman approached the stand slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. Her hands trembled as she reached the counter. "I saw you on the news," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I lost my husband 2 years ago. My children live far away. I felt forgotten." Ray stepped out from behind the counter and wrapped his arms around her. "You're not forgotten," he whispered. "You're home." She wept against his shoulder. Moments like that became common, and Ray understood something then, something deeper than the miracle itself. The multiplication hadn't stopped with the meat. It had moved into people. Faith multiplied. Hope multiplied. Love multiplied. One quiet night, long after the last customer had gone, Ray wiped down the counter alone. The lights hummed softly. The air was still. Then faintly he smelled it again. Flowers. Just for a moment, Ray closed his eyes, a smile breaking through tears. "Thank you," he whispered. Years passed. Ray grew older. His hair turned white, his hands slowed, but his spirit remained strong. Carlos learned to work the grill like a master. Rosie greeted every guest with the same phrase, spoken proudly and clearly. "Welcome to Tacos of Grace, where love tastes better." On the wall near the entrance, Ray placed a small bronze plaque. It read, "On a cold night, Jesus came disguised as hunger, and a man chose love over fear. Tourists came, pilgrims came, but so did the hungry, and no one ever left empty." 5 years after that first night, Ray locked up the stand and sat alone on a bench nearby, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Martha sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Can you believe all this started with 3 tacos?" she asked quietly. Ray chuckled. "I almost didn't give them." "But you did," she said. And everything changed. Ray looked toward the stand, glowing warmly in the evening light. "I still wonder," he said softly, "how many times we walk past Jesus without knowing, how many chances we miss because we think we don't have enough." Martha squeezed his hand. "But now you know." Ray nodded. The miracle had never been about money, or food, or even survival. It had been about a choice. A choice to give when it hurt, to love when it was risky, to trust when everything said not to. And that choice, simple, quiet, ordinary, had set heaven in motion. Because the greatest miracle was not what appeared on the grill. It was what appeared in a human heart. And as Ray had learned on a cold night beneath a dim streetlight, heaven never forgets those who love without conditions. Before you go, take a moment to sit with this story. Not with the miracle, not with the light or the money or the food, but with the choice. Because the truth is, most of us will never see heaven open in a flash of light. Most of us will never smell flowers in the middle of a dark street. But all of us will be tested in quiet moments. In ordinary moments, in moments when someone stands before us hungry, tired, unseen, and asks for help. Ray didn't know it was Jesus standing at his truck. He didn't give because he expected a miracle. He gave because love asked more of him than fear did. And that is where heaven begins. So tonight, ask yourself gently, honestly, who has been standing in front of me that I didn't recognize? Who have I passed by because I thought I didn't have enough? What am I holding on to so tightly that I'm afraid to let go? Maybe Jesus will never ask you for 3 tacos, but he might ask for your patience, your time, your kindness, your forgiveness, your attention. And maybe, just maybe, he's already been asking. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to do 3 simple things. First, pause and reflect, not on Ray's miracle, but on your own life. Where is God inviting you to trust again? Second, share this story with someone who may be struggling, someone who feels forgotten, someone who wonders if heaven still sees them. And finally, join our community here on YouTube by subscribing to Heaven Walks With Us. This channel exists for one reason, to remind you that God still walks beside us. In ordinary streets, in quiet sacrifices, and in acts of love no one else may ever see. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or share a prayer request. You are not alone, and your story matters. Because the same Jesus who walked into a taco truck on a cold night is still walking today, still asking, still waiting, still loving. And when we choose love over fear, generosity over scarcity, faith over doubt, heaven responds, "Thank you for listening." May peace walk with you tonight. Heaven walks with us.